we continue the works. We were quite late, but we are on time. On time. And we finished at the time it is supposed to be. Because, as we say in Haitian Creole, sac vide, pas campé. An empty bag doesn't stay. So, this is the session about Judaism. I was speaking French with my colleague, but now I am speaking English. It is okay. We might speak another language, even Hebrew, no, but not me. The first speaker who gives the lecture is Professor Sergio DellaPergola. L'accentuation? Pergola, yeah. For a French speaking, it is very difficult. In French, it is always at the end. I want brother gives a good representation of the complexity of religion in this world, but the complexity is also inside each religion, and maybe especially in Judaism. This is the subject, the topic. The Professor Pergola will speak about. I don't have to present, he is very well known, and his topic has this title, Contemporary Judaism and the Jews, Continuity and Change. That is complete as what he wrote and what most of us read before the session. I leave you the parole.
Je m'assieds.
Oui.
Okay, good morning. Thank you very much. And thanks especially to Roberto Cipriani for the wonderful organization and conceptualization of this meeting. I guess I was chosen as the first presenter after the excellent paper by Patrice Brodeur because Judaism is probably the smallest of the world religions, and it is also one of the oldest. We have to realize, of course, that the normative and ideational nature of Judaism and the operational and empirical patterns of Jewish identity have been the subject of a lot of research. It's not easy to find consensus within this. And what I will show, therefore, is a variety of findings based on recent social research, but without forgetting a general framework, which I hope can be of use also in the study of other major religious groups. And so as a first consideration, just to show how certain basic concepts can be applied to basically anything that concerns our major theme of reference, I think that there are certain basic concepts that we have to incorporate. The first one is that each religion, and specifically Judaism, concerns a certain relevant subject matter. There are certain contents which are peculiar to the specific group or idea. And so interchangeably, we can use Judaism or anything else. So the contents is very important, and it is not neutral because the contents can be very different. Then turning to the personal, that is moving to the populations concerned, there are two concepts which are unfortunately used interchangeably, but this has to be clarified. The term of identity, when we speak of religious identity, refers to something that I will use in the sense of the innermost feeling of what it means to me as a person or to others. The problem is that this innermost feeling is not easy to measure. It can be hidden sometimes. Everybody knows, but it cannot be often communicated perfectly. And therefore, rather than identity, I suggest to use identification. At least this is the practice following Simon Herman, who was a follower of Kurt Lewin and others. Identification is the part that is visible and measurable. And since I deal with empirical studies, then most of what we see is the publicly expressed in terms of behaviors, norms, of what the inner feeling is. Of course, there is a mutual relationship between the two. Probably one affects the other more than vice versa, but also the symmetric arrow, directional influence can be true. And then there is a further element, which is the perception by others. The outside world perceives that particular group in a way which is sometimes independent, sometimes somewhat related, and sometimes hostile, by the way, but it ends also by influencing quite deeply the feelings of the group concerned. And so there is a further interaction between the group and the rest of the world. So therefore, all of these mutual relationships have to be understood and studied if possible. Now, in our case, we have four basic questions that I will deal rapidly today. What do people think Judaism is? The basic definition, which addresses the basic meaning of the lemma and as perceived by members of the given collective, or also outside of it. So in one word, how you define Judaism, and we'll see in a moment what it can be. Second, why are people attached to Judaism, or to that other specific group? The leading motivation, which relates to the world of contents, whether imagined or expressed throughout the collective. Three, how do Jews express their identification with Judaism? The personal life, as it reflects the ideational and behavioral modes preferred, the personal relational networks with others to represent themselves within and outside of the collective. And we'll exemplify that. And finally, the question which sometimes is considered the most paradigmatic, but I definitely decided to put it in the end, who is a Jew? That is, how do we define the group and what are the pertinent boundaries of definition of that particular subpopulation? And so graphically, we see that we have the why, first of all, the what, the why, and the how. I see that me and Professor Brother, we use the same software. There was no coordination. It's a simple and useful device. And so we see that there are certain predetermined contents. The what can be Judaism as a religion, as an ethnicity, as a parentage, as culture, and so on. Why some of the main themes that motivate people to be attracted and to belong and to participate, remembrance of the Shoah, the Holocaust, believing in God, a community, Israel as a point of reference, and the how in personal life to be very religious, what we call Orthodox or Haredi, or Reform and Progressive, or just Jewish, or just mixed something and something else, or nothing, the knowns. And as you see, there is a substantial overlap between these individual domains, so that neither can be considered in separation from the other. There are certain mutual influences between the three main parameters, as we shall also argue later. Much more in detail, the written paper is a monstrosity of 70 pages. Those who have the patience to read it will have the full paper. Here I'm cutting very, very quickly through it. And so, first of all, a few words about the historical evolution of the Jews in terms of what has been the demography, the basic configuration. Here, very quickly, we learn from this, which spreads over something like 900 years. And again, incidentally, I'm not going into discussion of the data, the quality of the data, the methodologies. This can be left open to the discussion. But let's assume that we can rely to some extent on the information available. We learn from this two things. things. One is the general numerical development of the Jews worldwide, and two, the geographical distribution of them throughout time. And in terms of the numbers, you see there is a first period of low numbers and stability, determined very much by negative attitudes of the general environment, persecutions, expulsions, mass killings, and forced conversions from Judaism. The expulsion from Spain and Portugal is a well-known historical fact, but there are other incidences of the kind. There is no way to expand. Then, basically, with the beginning of general modernization and some improvement in health conditions, we see a very quick population growth, which is in fact much faster than the general population growth of the regions where Jews were concentrated. And so from 1 million, basically, in 1700, we reach about 16.5 million Jews on the eve of World War II. Then we have the tragic inflection due to the Holocaust, reducing to less than, to basically 11 million and something. And then the last period, which shows some growth. We shall return to this in a moment. What also is very dramatic is the geographical change in terms of the major continents and therefore the major centers of cultural influence that affect the minority, because of course the minority is exposed to the patterns of the hegemonic majority wherever they are. And so we see from the beginning in the Middle East, going back to the early Middle Ages, Jews come originally from the Middle East. They are still concentrated in the Middle East during the Middle Ages. Then a movement to Western Europe, but the expulsion from Western Europe causes the need to relocate. Eastern Europe at that time is a more favorable, less developed, but also initially a less hostile environment. So we see the huge growth of Judaism, especially in Eastern Europe. And then the next stage is the transmigration toward new areas beyond the ocean, North America, Latin America, and other transoceanic places, whereas therefore the main centers develop. We see that the Shoah has caused the dramatic reduction, especially in Eastern Europe, also in Western Europe. Western Europe, by the way, never was the hegemonic place of the Jews. There were substantial and very influential communities there, but never the relative or absolute majority. And finally, in the last period after World War II, we see the growth of a part which was in fact the most ancient player, the land of Israel, the Holy Land, Palestine, where the state of Israel is created, and it becomes one of the more significant presences. So vis-a-vis the past, today there is fundamentally two main centers, as we shall see in a moment, but what is fundamental here is to observe the moving center of gravity of the Jewish civilization across different regions, very different from the point of view of socioeconomic development, ideas, cultures, and fundamentally the cleavage between Christianity on the one hand and Islam on the other hand. These are the two main poles of reference. Looking at the situation after 1945, we see the growth of the total Jewish population with the upper line, which shows periods of growth and stagnation. And today, roughly 15.5 millions, as against 11 millions in 1945. The orange dot line is the growth of total world population on a scale 1,000 times higher. And it shows, therefore, how, in fact, much slower the Jewish population with the black line upside is vis-a-vis the orange dotted line. But interestingly, the pale blue line just below is the state of Israel, which goes really in parallel with the total world population growth, which means it is a very significant growth. It is due initially to immigration, in the second part to natural increase, but it means that Israel is keeping a pace with the total world. However, the green line in between is the rest of the world, Jews out of Israel in the so-called Jewish diaspora. dispersion, and that's a totally different story. It is holding in the beginning, then it is declining. Part of the decline is due to international migration, especially to Israel, but also to intrinsic patterns of aging, assimilation, loss of interest, and also prevalence of deaths over births. Finally, there is a red dotted line which sharply declines. It represents the percentage of Jews out of total world population. And it is, of course, a tiny minority all the time. But it is interesting to note how, since the end of World War II to date, it has declined by more than half. That is, there are today more or less 2 Jews per 1,000 population. In 1945, it was more or less 5 per 1,000. And before the Holocaust, before the Shoah, it was way higher. So it means that the numbers cause a relative decline. Not that the numbers are the main part of what we are studying, but they cannot be neglected either for a variety of purposes, which I cannot discuss here. The world, the 20 largest core Jewish populations in the last 50 years have also undergone dramatic change, a shift which is manifested here mostly in 2 ways. First, the substitution of the leading population. On the left, red versus blue, and on the right, blue versus red. They signify the fact that Israel has now grown to be the largest single Jewish population worldwide, followed by the United States, which previously were the largest one. So this is, of course, a significant change. Second, the stronger concentration today, about 85% of the people are concentrated in the 2 main countries, whereas in the past they were much more dispersed. So this has, of course, cultural significance. And of course, studying the patterns of religion, this is very relevant. Some parts have totally disappeared through complete emigration, or the very large majority of the people moving out. Other parts hold more or less. In any case, it is a much less diverse population in terms of the geography. Does not mean that diversity does not remain inside, as we shall see in a moment. All of this, though, points to a definite westernization of the picture, in the sense that countries in Africa, Asia, meaning North Africa, the Middle East, to some extent also South America, Eastern Europe, very significantly, have lost very much of their presence, mostly through international migration, and so they have moved to strengthen the demography of the 2 main locations. Now I move to the discussion of the contents, having given a very short outline of the people and the numbers. And I move to a very, I would say, elementary portray of Jewish identification as it can be viewed historically. We have 2 situations, past and present. In the past, considering also the unequal legal status of the Jews and the patterns of discrimination that prevailed nearly everywhere, if you think that Judaism is not simply a religion, that is, of course, Judaism is a welcome guest at this conference, but Judaism cannot be reduced to a religion. It is also peoplehood, as we shall see. It is a culture. It is many things, some of which are really innovative vis-à-vis the past. We find that in the past, all of these different options to define the main concept were totally overlapping. There was a wall separating Jews from the non-Jewish majority. And so people were recognized by their belief, their residential quarter, there was a ghetto with walls around, by their occupation, they would be limited to a certain limited number of possible occupations, and by several other characteristics such as languages and other aspects. With the emancipation and modernization, and to some extent secularization of societies, these patterns tend to open up and to be less overlapping. And so today you can be a Jew by the religion, but not recognize yourself as a Jew by ethnicity. Vice versa, you can see yourself as Jew nationally, but not by religion. Or culturally, knowing or not knowing even the most elementary components of what would be a core of consensual Judaism. And then there are new patterns, and one of them, which is very prominent and unavoidable in this discussion, for example, is the national movement that brings to the independence of the State of Israel in 1948, and which becomes one of the aggregation points in contemporary Jewish identity, which has to be discussed and evaluated, and which, of course, did not exist in the past. And so you have, to some extent, a broader and more fluid distribution of the options to identify, and this is a significantly different situation in terms of what it was. And another thing which is unavoidable, of course, religious and ethnic identities are important, but they are not all. Each of us, at the same one and the same time, carries different identities, of course. And so there can be a geographical space, country, political entity. Okay, I am an Italian, or an Israeli, or a Chinese, and then I am a Jew, or a Buddhist, or a Muslim. And then I have a strong relationship to my social class. Personally, I'm an educated academic, but there are other options. And family, which is probably one of the strongest attachments. And all of these, to some extent, operate independently. Some of them overlap, sometimes unavoidably, sometimes in less evident ways. So we must be aware that there are different ways of feeling, presenting themselves by the people, and therefore thinking and operating in the total social space. What we do here is focusing on one part of the total mental space. Let's not forget there is more around it, and sometimes unavoidably connected, sometimes more independent. Now I move to the discussion of the what, the why, and the how. I begin from the what. What is Judaism? What is one mode, one way, one word to define Judaism? And here I present, out of many more options that we have, results of 3 major surveys. I've been involved in all of these 3 major surveys. The European survey conducted by the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union, the last time on record in 2018. The Pew first survey of American Jews conducted in the US in 2013, and the Pew survey of Israel Jews conducted in 2015. I had the honor to be in the steering committee of all of these. All of these 3 regions today concentrate about 90% at least of the total world Jewry. So we can say that we are on target besides smaller groups elsewhere. And here I focus on 2 elements. One, religion. How many people would say Judaism is a religion? Judaism is my religion. And we see that it is in the upper part when defined as religion only, whereas you have several options in general to define your identity in one word. And you have a religion also, that is a religion and something else out of a list of options that are offered. And then the alternative is ancestry. Ancestry is something that objectively you have not chosen. Religion you may have chosen because you always have the option to be inside or outside. Ancestry you don't choose, but that's a fact. And then ancestry only, or ancestry also, along with other options being ethnicity and being upbringing and being culture and other options. Now, what we learn is 2 things. One is that the religion only or religion also option is not the dominant. There is a good share of it, but it is not the strongest and often not even the majority when you have the possibility to make choices. Ancestry, which is a more passive mode of being belonging to a certain group, is certainly more dominant. The second thing is that with modest exceptions, there is a lot of consistency between the different geographical and cultural areas and geopolitical areas considered. So we are on top of a phenomenology which is relatively coherent with certain changes. For example, we learned that in Europe, more people say the religion than in the other 2 parts, which is interesting because Europe is, of course, one of the major focuses of secularization in the world, at least in the beginning. And however, there is, in fact, in the end, relatively minor differences in the hierarchy that I present in this case. The second aspect is that of the why. What does motivate? And here, out of more options, some of which we shall see later, is there are here 4 options: remembering the Holocaust, having a general feeling of belonging to the Jewish people, that is a peoplehood which is transnational. It is not perhaps so much defined in terms of its contents. Religion, generally, I know at least what should be the normative position, whether I do or do not follow. But peoplehood is something which is less defined. Then Israel, meaning having a certain feeling of support and empathy to Israel. And finally, God/Jewish law, being religious in the sense that I believe in God, I do perform the mitzvot, the commandments of Judaism. Well, as you see here again, there is a fundamental coherence in the hierarchy of the options suggested in Europe, US, and Israel. There are a few exceptions, namely that in Israel, the peoplehood option is more developed than elsewhere. But overall, the ranking of the major options is nearly the same, with Holocaust very prominently on top, and then declining to God and religiosity, which is important, but does concern very significantly, maybe 1/3, maybe less of the total. This is to give us, again, typology, which is internationally comparable, and I repeat, concerns more than 90% of the total global Jewish population. Now I move to a different way of representing the same data, and that's a schematic representation of the structure. I often use a method called similarity structure analysis, which takes not only the frequencies, but the covariation of the different options within a given population, calculates those covariation, sort of correlation, and then maps as points on a page the different variables, showing whether they are more proximate or more distant. There is greater correlation or minor correlation between the various options suggested, and then we shall see some schematic representation of the above. In order to represent what are we searching for, I shall say that we would be interested in understanding whether there is a core of shared contents among all. People may disagree on many aspects, but there are certain aspects in which they do agree, and that would be, therefore, the most fundamental starting point to define and to understand the specific collective. Second, a circle of particular specializations, where you can be stronger on one aspect, for example, believing in God, or stronger on another aspect, believing in the Jewish nation or in Jewish culture on other aspects. So I call them specialization A, B, and C. And then also, interestingly, if we have the possibility, I shall not go very much into the depth of this in this paper, but in other papers, there are sometimes non-pertinent contents that come from external society that become incorporated within the beliefs and behaviors and patterns of that particular group. So I call it relevant otherness. That is, ideas and modes of behavior that do not pertain, however they become very frequent and acceptable within the specific group, including negative prejudice, by the way, which can be incorporated as part of the identity of the group. So if this is the general conceptualization, and now we translate this into actual data, I present here 2 different cases. One case is Israel in 2015 and USA in 2013. And if you can read the labels, each point is a variable. The variables are ordered in a sort of circular pattern, which means that the distance have very little correlation. That is, people who say strongly on one thing, they probably say weakly on the other thing, more or less. And if you look, first of all, at Israel, on the right hand, you find more religion-related and belief-related contents and intimate social networks, the family and festivals and being together in a sense of more traditional group, giving to the community, being involved. Whereas on the left part, you find elements like ethics or Holocaust, which are more kind of historically related and kind of, to some extent, more universal and more secular related than respect to the right hand. I'm talking of Israel. Interestingly, at the center, expressing that expected consensus between, say, the secular and the religious, you find this sense of shared Jewish peoplehood. That is, there is a sense that beyond the differences and beyond the fact you live in a particular country and you know there are other people in other countries, the fact is that this is significant, and this can be the point where the secular and the religion can maintain a conversation. Shared Jewish peoplehood or solidarity. I move now to the US. And in the US, I find that fundamentally the configuration of the variables is the same. That is, on the right hand, you will find the questions are slightly different, but the conceptualization, and this is one of the advantages of SSA. If you ask two somewhat different questions, which in definitive mean to the same thing, you will find them exactly on the same point on the map. And so on the right hand, you find the normative ritual of God, of Shabbat and kosher and the family and the community. On the left hand, you find Holocaust and ethics and culture. And you find, though, something which is quite amazing. In the US, there is no center. And again, this repeats several other iterations that I've done. There is no one point where you can say American Jewry are consensual. They are strong, they are active, they are visible, they are influential. But sorry, I cannot say on what they, all of them can find a point of convergence. So I move now to the European Union. And I have two different points in time, 2012 and 2018. Again, based on two European Union Fundamental Rights Agency surveys, very big samples. In 2018, 16,000 Jews all across the European Union answered. In 2012, somewhat less, in many different countries. And here we have, again, a part which is common to the previous two configurations. Let's look at 2012. On the right hand, again, as we now know, the normative ritual. Each point is a variable. The family, religion, belief, community, philanthropy. On the left hand, Holocaust, anti-Semitism, culture, and also Israel and Jewish peoplehood, which are two concepts which are not strictly religious, of course. Interestingly, proximity, emotional to Israel, and a feeling of Jewish peoplehood are very strongly correlated or covariating in the mind of the respondents. We move to 2018, and we find that, again, the basic configuration is the same. On the right hand, the more religious, and on the left hand, the more secular or historical patterns. But Israel and Jewish peoplehood, still strongly correlated, have moved to the center of the configuration. This means that there has been a greater salience of the centrality of those arguments in the framework of the many options that you have to express and manifest the motives of your feeling Jewish. This is a very interesting development. It shows that, in fact, anything can change at any time. It has to reflect some historical circumstance. I believe, and I will discuss in a few minutes what I think can be an explanation. It reflects a response to what is felt as external pressure and a need to better define yourself in the context of total society. I return to this quite in extenso in a few minutes. Now, the third is the how. The how, that is how you express in public your Judaism, is shown by one variable, which is what is called denominations. religious denominations are somewhat ideological / organizational frameworks within which different Jewish communities operate. They reflect different readings of the theology and different assumptions about what is normative and what is not these days. We can start, in this case, from Israel and note that there is here on the upper right hand a strong percentage of people who define themselves Haredi Orthodox. Orthodox is, of course, meaning applying very, very systematically the dictate of the theology and of the doctrine. Haredi means the fearful, those who fear God, and they are the group which is most fundamentally, significantly operate in that sense, and also tend to reject modernity and segregate themselves socioeconomically from the rest of society. That is, it's a portion of society which is also physically highly visible in terms of dressing, thinking, talking, speaking, and also operating politically. That's a different chapter. In the second place, the part which is more visible is being traditional, conservative, which means, yes, observing, but not necessarily 100% of what one normative Jew should do, still on the conservative traditional part. We have a small, very tiny presence of the more modern progressive communities, mostly inspired from the United States, the conservative and the progressive movement. And finally, a large portion, which is in relative terms the largest, the seculars. In a moment, we shall also analyze them over time. So this is the configuration in Israel. Here on this plan, the situations in the different major cultural areas are very different. You see that in the US, the more strongly religious is smaller. Also, the fairly traditional, although not entirely, is also smaller. Much larger are the modern congregations of Reformed Jewry and similar aggregations, and there is a relatively smaller proportion of seculars. Let's not forget, and this is appears in the paper somewhere, that the United States of all of the Western world are probably the most religious society. The proportion defining themselves religious and God believers is much higher than in Europe. And finally, in Europe, we have, as I mentioned, a strong proportion of seculars. The proportions of very religious and moderately observant are somewhat intermediate between Israel and the US, and also the modern congregations are represented in a kind of intermediate way. So here, whereas in the two previous patterns of the what and the why, I found significant similarities. Here, I cannot say that. There are evident dissimilarities between the major regions. Just an observation of how this has evolved in Israel over the last 20 years. And you see that on the upper line, it's the seculars. It's fairly stable. There are moderate ups and downs. It means that it remains the relatively largest. To clarify, Israel is a secular state. It is not a theology. It is a state governed by law and by a parliament, a Supreme Court. And that's what is shown here, relatively stable so far. What is significantly increasing, though it is a minority, is this darker line. This is the most strongly observant and segregated segment of Israeli society, the Haredi element. And what interestingly is declining and therefore feeds the upper line is the sort of traditionalist, not so religious, those who are not so committed. They are neither totally secular, but certainly not significantly religious. The other two types are fairly stable. And so to clarify the point, we have this. The more religious have a much higher birth rate. So they are increasing just by a demographic factor. The seculars with a lower birth rate they incorporate people who are moving from more religious to less religious, and therefore they keep stability. And the moderate center is shrinking, and so it loses, in a sense, to the up and to the down of the configuration. The configuration overall is not dramatically changing over the last 20 years, but these trends are bound to continue. So in another 20 years, the pattern will be quite different. And then as a complement to the previous, if I now focus to a number of typical religious rituals, typical of Judaism, and of course each religion has different typical rituals, we find again that there is a hierarchy relatively consistent. For those who know, the Passover Seder is the festival meal on the occasion of the Jewish Easter, the Seder of Pesach. Then fasting on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the Day of Pardon, is the second most popular, followed by marking the Shabbat, by Rite de Passage, lighting candles on Friday nights, keeping kosher, that is choosing accurately the food that you can or you are forbidden from eating, and at least at home, and then attending synagogue weekly or more often. What we find here is that on any circumstance, the Israelis do more, but even on that account, the hierarchy between the possibilities is very much the same. And a simplistic way of doing it is saying that the Seder and Yom Kippur appear once a year, so it is easy to perform, whereas going every week to the synagogue is 52 times a year. I mean, that would be a simplistic mode. I think it's much deeper than that. The Seder of Pesach is also a sort of social gathering of the enlarged family, so it has extra religious elements besides the important religious component. The Yom Kippur is a personal act of faith. You can either do it or not, but note this. 68% affirm they do. We remember we had more than 45% of seculars. So it means that a good half, or maybe third of the seculars do fast once a year because they have to communicate with something transcendental. So it puts secularity between sort of quotes. If a secular has to, in any case, think of God at least once a year. And then another interesting phenomenon is that once, and I could do this with all of the previews, and I do this in the written paper, classify the different components by age. I find this, the younger, perhaps contrary to expectation, with regard to the various patterns of ritual behavior, do much more than the older. So here we have a classic representation of a process of desecularization, which is perhaps counterintuitive, but this is true in Israel. This is true also in the US, and we find this is based on Europe. We have that in Israel and we have that in the US, whereas the line, the dark line, descending is those who say, I do nothing of the above. Well, this is clearly declining. So here we have something that contradicts the expectation of assimilation, integration, and secularization. I have also a more sophisticated cohort analysis, which shows what is the incidence of the more religious part of the total configuration in Israel, the US, and the European Union. Each line is an age cohort. And to read you the Israeli part, each line compares what was your religiosity during childhood and what is your religiosity now. Okay. Now, descending lines mean that you were more religious at childhood and you are less religious now. This is the proportion of the more religious among the total. So consistently, with one exception, there is a decline of lifetime religiosity. This is not the macro as we saw it, this is the micro as applied to specific individuals. So we would say, therefore, Israel is a container of secularization. However, each cohort, from the older moving to the younger, is born more religious than the previous one. So demographically, also because of the different birth rate, each cohort, the younger are born more religious than the older, and then everybody becomes somewhat less religious during the lifetime. We have two opposing forces who sort of fight each other, and this explains to some extent also the relative stability of what was. Sorry?
We have
how much?
5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes will be dramatic, and so I will skip one word about the configuration of contemporary Jewish populations, meaning who is a Jew? That's the fourth question. Who? The who is visually configured in several concentric circles, which show, in fact, that there is a part which is clearly self-identified and also identified by others as pertaining. And then different groups which have a somewhat hybrid identity, partly Jewish, partly non-Jewish, until the broadest circle, which is defined here as the Israeli law of return. It is a law which allows immigration to the country by those who are Jews or children of Jews or grandchildren of Jews. This is a law that in one way or another also exists in Greece, in Germany, and in other European countries, in Hungary, allowing the ethnics of that particular country to come to the core country and receive the pertinent rights. However, what I am here stressing is that all of this is based on empirical study, operational conditions and definitions, whereas if we go to a normative definition, the normative definition according to Jewish orthodoxy would be that a Jew is the child of a Jewish mother. A Jewish mother is the daughter of a Jewish mother, and so on back until Sarah, the wife of Abraham, a few years ago. It's something which is declared, but of course very difficult to check in empirical terms with contemporary methodologies. And therefore, it is important to understand that one thing is the social configuration of a group with all of its extensions and peripheries, center and periphery. Something else is the theoretical, hypothetical concept, which cuts across and may include people who are totally unaware, but theoretically might be ascribed, and people who do belong and they are aware of it. So this is an important distinction. We work here by operational criteria and not by normative criteria. We do not substitute theology for the social sciences with all of its limits. Now, I have to say, in any case, a few words about the perception of the outside, and this takes just a few minutes before reaching the conclusions. And that's, as I mentioned, there is a sense of an increasing pressure in terms of the perceptions of the collective considered here. And we can say that based on the perceptions, there are three types of, let's call it negationism, that are perceived and especially imply the cognitive, the experience, but also the affective sphere of the mental structure. As an individual, what is the most conventional? That is denial of the right to be equal, to be incorporated, to be a citizen, enjoying all civil, social, cultural, and political rights. As a potential victim and a survivor of planned extermination, the right to preserve and transmit one's own authentic memory of the Shoah without being told what is consented memory and what is excessive memory. The question of how much memory is tolerated in society has become a bone of contention. And finally, as a member of a national collective, the right to exert a corporate national sovereignty, that is the right to declare an independent state, in this case Israel, which of course must be subject to international law, to patterns of decent behavior, good governance as any other country. But the very fact of having the right to that country is considered non-negotiable and sometimes is not accepted. I unfortunately have to cut. The point is that these different components in the perception of the external pressure are strongly organized, and here you have a pattern of the mental organization of these variables, Jewish-related, Holocaust-related, and Israel-related, in the collective mind of 16,000 Jews, the representative sample of European Jews, in which you can see that it is very difficult not to incorporate the three components within one model. What is interesting and perhaps somewhat innovative is that the cognitive perception of a phenomenon versus the experienced perception of that phenomenon occupy two distinct areas in the total perception. That is, anything which is cognitive tends to be somewhat exaggerated. That is, I think that that specific sentence, that specific expression is negative. I think. Different is the matter whether I have had the experience of having contact with that specific phenomenon or assertion. The two parts are clearly different, and the upper part produces much higher frequencies than the bottom part. However, the mental organization into the major patterns of contents is very coherent. And also, what appears is that once you add upon that perception the perception of who the perpetrators are, and what the channels of distribution are, yes, you get very interesting typology by which you see certain mental connections that are performed by the people themselves, which brings to typology of practical anti-Semitism, which is physical violence, political anti-Semitism, which is manifested through the political system, the populist form of the social networks, the sports stadium, and graffiti and the square, and the narrative anti-Semitism of the more sophisticated portion, sometimes claimed in the press, in the academia, and at cultural events, whereas the web is the omnipresent vector of all of these contents. So I come to my concluding remarks very quickly, saying that, first of all, to have a true understanding, you need la longue durée. You cannot look at the present without considering history. Second, you cannot look at the local without a global spatial perspective. Third, patterns of modernization, secularization, assimilation in the long term have eroded the community. However, they have also produced innovation of critical importance, producing new patterns and new ways of identification. And a trend of desecularization, as I argued, is visible today, contrary to the expectation of a more neutral society. This is not happening. Contrary to the optimistic outlook following World War II and the Shoah, the attitude of the outside non-Jewish environment is today perceived by most Jews as carrying increasing elements of hostility and intellectual, if not actually physical violence. Judaism as a set of prescriptive or freely chosen norms cannot be reduced to a linear continuum between strong and weak. It doesn't work that way. It is a multivariate complex. And in the end, we find that there are at least three positive models, which I have outlined shortly: the normative ritual, the national communitarian, and the cultural memory-oriented pattern. These three patterns are all operating somewhat independently. They are correlated. They have constituted historically and do constitute also a source of confrontation within and often even mutual open hostility within the total collective, especially when translated into representative political frameworks. And if you feel there was a vague allusion in my last sentence, the answer is yes. Thank you.
But now it is we have one discutant, one for the discussion, Professor Eprahim Tabory from the Bar-Illan University in Ramat Gan. I'm sure it is not good for the pronunciation, but it doesn't matter. And I invite the professor to speak right now.
Except that since this is we are discussing the sociology of religion, I will leave God out of it. And I will just say thank you very much and assume that there are cultural differences in the way conferences are held in Italy and the way they are held in Israel. The title of my paper, which you do not have, is The Rabbinate and the Relationship of Religion and State in Israel, Implications for Judaism. Professor Sergio DellaPergola has provided us with a comprehensive survey of the research that he and others have conducted on Jewish identity and identification. As a respondent, I will present a framework for his review of religious movements by addressing the major issues that currently impact on Judaism. In my written response, I elaborate briefly on the history of Judaism presented by Professor DellaPergola by focusing on the evolution of rabbinic Judaism, in which rabbis play a central role in the development of Jewish law. In my oral response today, I will focus mainly on the development of contemporary denominations in Judaism and the relationship of religion and state in Israel. Secularization and globalization have had a dynamic impact on the development of Judaism, not only in Israel, but on world Jewry as well. At our gathering today, we almost automatically talk about how members of religious movements are different from one another. The philosopher and rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks has written that as Jews, we believe that God has made a covenant with a singular people, but that does not exclude the possibility of other peoples, cultures, and faiths finding their own relationship with God. God is God of all humanity, but no single faith is the faith of all humanity. Professor DellaPergola's presentation suggests that to some extent, no single faith is the faith even of all Jews. He points out that of those respondents who affirm that Judaism is a religion, only about 50% think that it is very important to believe in God as part of their Jewish identity. As told in the Bible, the first Israelite was Abraham, who was chosen by God to be the father of a great nation, which would find its home in the land given to it by God. The descendants of Abraham and his son Isaac became the Jewish people, but of course, and thus the name Abraham accords as the political agreement between Israel and several Muslim states. Historically, Judaism could have developed in various ways. Various sects rose, flourished, and disappeared. The rabbinate as an institution succeeded in becoming a supreme religious authority whose decisions bind all those under its jurisdiction. The prototype of the chief rabbinate was the Great Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, which until the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, issued legislation and interpretations of Jewish laws for all the Jewish people. Jewry has had no central authority since at least the year 425. Some communities, though, have seen the advantage of having a chief rabbi at various times. Technically, the authority of all rabbis is equal, but at times, particular rabbis are viewed as leading authorities by groups of adherents. While basic Jewish religious laws have remained the same over generations, rabbis constantly modified the law to adjust it to contemporary situations. Because Judaism became a closed legal system, as the term is used in the sociology of law, rabbis reinterpreted earlier texts as needed rather than openly altered laws. As in other closed legal systems, legal fictions are also used in the Orthodox Jewish world to adjust to contemporary needs. The use of electricity produced through Jewish labor on the Sabbath should be forbidden. It is permitted only because the electricity also serves hospitals, and thus the Jewish laborers are allowed to do work on the Sabbath that saves lives, and the general religious public can benefit indirectly. The law forbidding certain food products to be kept and stored by Jews over the Passover holiday. is dealt with by formally selling the forbidden products to a non-Jew for the 8-day period with a contract that is automatically canceled at the end of the holiday. Carrying objects on the Sabbath in a public area, which includes mundane but necessary items like keys and glasses, is forbidden by religious law, but it is made religiously permissible by an elaborate method of delimiting the public area so that it constitutes a private area where carrying is permissible. Technology is also enlisted to make life for the Orthodox Jews easier. Turning lights on and off and pressing an elevator button are forbidden acts on the Sabbath. Timers, though, are used to turn appliances on and off and to enable using an elevator without having to press a button. Orthodox religious law in Judaism determines what people should and should not do on a daily basis. The Mishnah and Talmud periods of Judaism, 200 to 500, discussed and analyzed 613 commandments, but the most famous formulation was undertaken by Maimonides between 1170 and 1180. The oral law that had been passed down through the generations and was consciously or unconsciously modified was thus codified, distributed, and accepted by Jews around the world as representing the binding commandments of God. Nevertheless, as in the case of many religions, in contemporary society, people choose to observe and disregard practices and yet identify as members of the religious group, or as Professor DellaPergola's overview shows, to be members of a Jewish ethnicity or identification with an ancestry, given the changing demography and geography of the Jews. He focuses on what Jews do, how they identify, and to the extent that survey data can provide relevant information, why they do what they do. The analysis of motivations, understanding the inner human psyche, is a difficult challenge for social science. What is shown in these studies is that the Jews are a very diverse group with much that unites them, but also much that divides them. And as I have indicated, this is particularly so in contemporary times. I turn now to denominationalism in contemporary Judaism. Although changed and modified, the law in the distant past was sacrosanct, and the few Jews who rejected religious law were considered beyond the pale. This situation changed in modern times. Secularization has very much impact on Judaism. There has been a tremendous increase in the number of Jews who do not follow traditional religious law, and as that happened, it became necessary to reconsider the attitude to those of their brethren, male and female, who became heretics. Of special significance was the situation of German Jewry around the 19th century. The Enlightenment had a significant impact on the internal development of Judaism. German Jews were granted greater legal rights and social acceptance. Jews who wanted to leave the fold could do so, but there were many who wanted to retain their adherence to the Jewish entity as well as their national identity. The principle of the religious movement that sought to adapt to religious change, to social change, and that came to be known as progressive or Reform Judaism, was that Judaism is a religion and not a nation. Its special focus was on denying the ethnicity of Jewish religion. This movement felt that just as Christians and Protestants could identify with the state in which they lived, so should Jews be able to do so. The movement was led by Rabbi Abraham Geiger and others who sought to continue the Jewish tradition, but modernize Jewish worship and practices to make them more relevant to contemporary life and acceptable in their social environment. Loyalty to a foreign entity was considered anathema, and the Reform movement removed from the liturgy all connection with the land of Israel and prayers that expressed mourning for the loss of the temple and hope for its reconstruction. Geiger was an intellectual whose scholarly work analyzed the influence of Judaism on the development of other religions and on spreading the concept of monotheism. He became a rabbi because, as a Jew, he could not obtain a university professorship. He worked with other rabbis in other localities to use the vernacular in the liturgy at the expense of the Jewish national language, Hebrew. The movement that developed as he tried to adapt Judaism to contemporary society adopted an open orientation to religious change. They simply rejected and abolished many traditional practices, such as wearing a head covering, keeping kosher dietary laws, and observing the Sabbath, with its myriad regulations. Instead, emphasis was focused on the ethical and spiritual aspects of Judaism. The practices they eliminated had served Judaism well in the past, as many of the abolished rituals had the effect of inhibiting or limiting contact with the non-Jewish world, thus helping to preserve an insular Jewish religious identity. The closed religious world of traditional Judaism, with its rigid socialization and strong internal social control, was now being challenged by a movement that sought integration in the external world and that was growing rapidly. Traditional Judaism could more easily deal with religious dropouts who said that religious life was not for them than it could with a movement that claimed that change had religious legitimacy. As an institution, Reform Judaism became a competitor movement. It is noteworthy that progressive or Reform Judaism was instrumental in the formulation of Orthodox Judaism as a separate denomination. The earliest known mention of the term Orthodox Jews was made in 1795. The word Orthodox was borrowed from the German Enlightenment discourse and used not to denote a specific religious group, but rather those Jews who opposed Enlightenment. During the early and mid-19th century, with the advent of the progressive movement among German Jews, and especially early Reform Judaism, the term Orthodox, the term Orthodox became the negative term used by traditionalists against espoused conservative traditions on the issues raised by modernization. It later became a badge of honor, and it supplanted the term Torah true Jews. Conservative Judaism, or the historical school, arose in Europe as a counter-reaction to the extremes of the Reform movement in the late 19th century. The members sought religious change, but it was conservative in wanting to maintain much of tradition and to retain a traditional approach to the manner in which religious change was accomplished. It formally declared its belief in the divine origin of the Torah, the Bible, and the importance of Jewish law, but also recognized the need for flexibility and adaptation in response to changing circumstances. This movement greatly flourished in the United States. Indeed, one of the pioneer social science researchers of Judaism, Marshall Sklair, coined conservative Judaism as the American Jewish movement. The Reform and conservative movements developed different orientations toward the sensitive issues of defining who is a Jew, conversion practices, acceptance of intermarriage, and the role of women in the synagogue and ritual practice. Over time, the differences between the movements are waning, but this has not necessarily affected the institutional loyalty and identity of the members. Orthodox Judaism rejects the conservative movement no less than it does the Reform, again, because of the argument that only Orthodox Judaism is the legitimate religious expression of Judaism. The other institutions on the path, it claims, are only halfway houses on the path to full secularization. In Israel, there is no chief rabbi in the United States, and indeed, none of the three major Jewish denominations has a formal chief rabbi. The situation in Israel is fundamentally different from North America and the UK, for that matter. Before the establishment of the state in 1948, the Jewish community in Palestine was under the jurisdiction of the Ottoman Empire, and later under the British Mandate. The rabbinate was organized by various religious Orthodox communities, including Ashkenaz and Sfarad Jews, and was responsible for overseeing Jewish religious affairs, such as marriage and divorce. In 1921, the chief rabbinate of Palestine was established by the British Mandatory Authorities. This institution was responsible for overseeing all Jewish religious affairs in Palestine. The holder of the office of chief rabbi was appointed by the Jewish community and approved by the British authorities. After the establishment of the state in 1948, The chief rabbinate became the official religious authority of the state. It was given the power to regulate marriage, divorce, conversion. In parallel, Muslim courts have sole authority in these matters as far as Muslims are concerned. The entire rabbinate office in Israel is under strict Orthodox control, but the power of Orthodox Judaism goes beyond the rabbinate. The state school system is mainly divided into two trends, a state trend and a national religious trend that inculcates its pupils with religious values geared to the rigid observance of Orthodox precepts and acceptance of Orthodox Judaism as the sole legitimate representation of Judaism. In addition, there are separate ultra-Orthodox schools that focus only on religious education, secular studies that might enable graduates to pursue a career in secular society are eschewed. The socialization process in the state religious schools that is geared toward more modern Orthodox Jews leads to an internalization of religious ideals that extends beyond practice into political belief, such as the conviction that the occupied West Bank is territory promised to Israel by God, and it is therefore the legitimate right and duty of the state to retain the land forever. In fact, they do not recognize or identify the West Bank as occupied, but call it by its biblical name, Judea and Samaria. The upshot of this is that the conflict between the right and the left in Israel is not only based on political perceptions, but also religious orientations. The national religious orientation that characterizes the school system is supported by Jews who basically identify themselves as national religious Jews. The term Orthodox is hardly used in Israel. Ultra-Orthodox Jews to whom I have referred are identified as Haredim, or those who are fearful before God. Many members of this group reject the state as a legitimate political enterprise, believing that it is the Messiah that must bring redemption to the Jewish state, not a secular state authority. Aside from religious Jews in Israel, there are so-called traditional and non-religious categories. Various studies question just what non-religious means, as this group observes a considerable number of religious rituals, even if they do this as part of Israel's civil religion and not because of their belief in God. The number of ideologically secular Jews appears to be quite small. This situation contributes to the hegemony of Orthodox Judaism in Israel, as Orthodox Jews view themselves as a religious community, while ideologically secular Jews are no more than an aggregate of individuals. Enter the Reform and conservative denominations that now have a small institutional presence in Israel, but are not recognized by the dominant monopolistic Orthodox denomination. Orthodox institutions, rabbis, and courts hold significant legal and social power in the Jewish sector of Israel. There is little separation of religion and state, and the state's close relationship with Orthodox Judaism is exclusionary and discriminatory, as it denies the legitimacy of non-Orthodox Jews to serve as recognized rabbis. Orthodox politicians and rabbis argue that the state's recognition and support of Orthodox institutions is necessary to maintain a strong and cohesive Jewish identity and to ensure the survival of the Jewish people. The dependence of the ruling parties in contemporary Israel on Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox political parties gives these entities extraordinary political clout to exact religious demands. These include allowing Haredi schools to continue their emphasis on religious studies and not even require a minimum amount of general studies as part of their program. Ultra-Orthodox Jews are granted an exemption from serving in the military that could expose them to non-religious influences. This is done in a society that otherwise has universal conscription for its non-Arab citizens. There is little public transportation, or only limited public transportation on the Jewish Sabbath. Orthodox law regulates issues of personal status. There are ongoing efforts to allow discrimination of women, including the requirement that women on bus routes that primarily serve the ultra-Orthodox population sit at the back of the bus, and that cultural events that so wish can segregate men and women. As mentioned, the Orthodox religious establishment denies the legitimacy of Reform conservative Judaism. In fact, the term in Israel overlaps the term with a term dati or religious. Since Reform and conservative Judaism are not Orthodox or dati, meaning religious, they are by definition not perceived by much of the Jewish population as legitimate religious movements. The rejection of Reform and conservative Judaism by state authorities in Israel is seen by Reform and conservative Jews around the world as undermining their Jewish identity. This contributes to their distancing from Israel. I have tried to present just enough issues in my time frame to indicate how Judaism, a religion of practice and ritual, was led by rabbis and sages throughout the generations. Some practices were clearly affected and shaped by the social environment in which they developed. An analysis of the impact of Greek and Roman practices and other sources on the development of Judaism is beyond the scope of this paper. I have noted that some of the laws of traditional Judaism had the effect of limiting contact and social intercourse with non-Jews, and thus preserve an isolationist Jewish identity. I note also that globalization has an impact on the conservative rulings of Orthodox rabbis, who know that the dissemination of their religious decisions is no longer restricted to their local congregants. Rabbis appear to be more fearful now that lenient rulings will be subject to criticism by more strict authorities as their decisions appear on the social media. While Professor DellaPergola notes that in some localities younger Jews show a tendency to observe more than the earlier generation, by and large, Judaism as a religion faces a challenge as its adherents are increasingly accepted in the world, and as the laws of Judaism are seen as preventing social integration in non-Jewish society. On the other hand, anti-Semitic incidents around the world remind Jews that they continue to be treated as others, even as they might desire complete social integration. There is some defection from ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and there are also hidden heretics or imposters who outwardly behave as ultra-Orthodox Jews, but actually no longer observe the religious commandments. Still, the high birth rate of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews and the strong social control that both groups exert on their members ensured their continued growth in general and the ability to shape religious issues under the coalition government in Israel. I conclude with a personal thought. A few days ago, I viewed an exhibit at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The sculptures by an Israeli artist, Sigalit Landau, were created out of salt from the Dead Sea. Landau hopes to someday actually erect a bridge made of salt over the Dead Sea to express, quote, her dream of spanning the burning sea, of bridging religions, peoples, and points of view. This amazing conference, in which we discuss religions and groups that are different from one another, and whose relationship with one another are as fragile at times as a sculpture made of salt, is, I trust, a manifestation of the hope that we share for greater sociological insight of the factors that lead to difference and thus contribute to understanding and tolerance. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Professor Tabory for his comments and compliments to the demonstration of DellaPergola. For the vote, if I want to, I would say something between Patrick's brother and the two other on Jewish. Patrick's brother esquisses a frame to understand the complexity of religion in our world from different perspectives. we had a very good chance. The presentation on Judaism are demonstrates concretely what does it mean in a religion, the complexity. What it means concretely in one, and it is not less. There is no less complexity in a smaller religion, which is a worldwide at the same time, than for a view of all the religion at the same time. If it is possible to do, it is not true. It is not true. And for that, we have to think the presentations we had this morning. It was a very high, and as we say in the French Parisian, not too bad. Not too bad, that means excellent or very bien, very good. There are about 20 minutes. Yeah, it's okay. Because I'm not the chief. Bon, 20 minutes for questions or comments. It would be better to begin by questions, but it might be comments. But as we have only 20 minutes, it should be brief one. First, what's your name and what you are, and 2 words. From where you are speaking. Yeah.
My name is Jean Berly. That's all. That's enough. First, I want to thank you so much because your presentation was very clear. Very clear. But I have just one small question. You spoke of Jewish mother, but could you say a word about the position of women nowadays in Judaism? Position of women. What is the situation? Because at the present time, we ask many questions. What is the position of women? Women wanting to have a better position, and so on and so forth.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's a big question, but as I argued in my presentation, you always have to keep this distinction in mind between the normative and the operational. So, but one thing is that what theoretical categories there are. Another thing is what really happens in the real world. And of course, there is a relation between the two. Now, in normative Judaism, of course, after a very careful reading of the Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and all of the rabbinical rulings, there is no question about the inequality and separation between the two genders, clearly stated. However, I would have a strong argument against those who would say, since it is different, it implies a hierarchy of the good and the bad, of the strong and the weak. I don't think this would be a correct reading. I think there is a division of labor, which is manifestly clear. However, in reading the ancient text and then interpretation, I think that division of labor between men and women allocates a substantial share of power to the woman. Of course, the man is a priori the leader, and it is the more represented and the more recalled. But you cannot say that the woman, if you look at, again, the authentic, pristine text, it does not appear and does not have a rule, to the point that sometimes you think that it is apparently secondary, but it becomes fundamentally primary. Of course, I can elaborate on a variety of things. Let me think just of one episode. There is one episode that comes to my mind, which to some extent may be extended. Moses was undisputedly the great political leader of the ancient Hebrews and Israelites by the text. Of course, I'm not now contending that the text is actual history. This would lead us to a different province. But it is still a text which has very interesting sociological meaning if you read it with contemporary tools. Moses had a black wife. The black wife was the daughter of a non-Jewish prophet called Yitro. So in a sense, this was very anti-normative. Moses also had a sister called Miriam. And this sister, if you read the whole story now without entering, has a huge personality and a huge power in admonishing Moses on what he's doing or is not doing. At some point, God punishes Miriam because she had made a remark which apparently could be constructed as racist. This is the plain story as is. At some point, Miriam becomes leprous, because leper at that time means that the color of your skin becomes excessively white. So you were against that black woman. Okay, now you are excessively white and you are expelled from the camp. And then at some point she can re-enter. On another occasion, you see that the same Miriam has a huge power upon her more famous brother. So this is one fact. Another fact is, again, if I go to the ancient role of Sarah versus Abraham and of Rivka, Rebecca in front of Yitzchak, and the two women, Rachel and Leah, in front of Jacob and so on, you understand that theoretically there is a hierarchy, but in fact these women have a huge power in decision making. In fact, the fact that Jacob and not Esau became the progenitor is a decision of his mother, Rebecca, who by astute manipulation of the situation substitute the older son, they were twins, but there is one who is number one and one is number two. Number one was Esau, number two was Jacob. The mother preferred Jacob, and she operates manipulatively in a way that Jacob becomes the preferred son, and therefore the Israelites are called the sons of Jacob, who later on becomes renamed Israel. So to make a long story short, I've given a few examples in which the woman is the actual leader. She is somewhat concealed. I would elaborate on something else if I'm allowed, and that's sociologically interesting and of some interest for demography and the medical sciences. You may know that sexual relations are forbidden during the cycle of the month for about a third of the month. And it is therefore finally who decides when sexual relations can be resumed. Of course, it's the woman, because she knows what is the condition. The man cannot know. And so the woman will be the one who commands the game. And so if this is important in the life cycle and in the structure of a society and of a community and of a nuclear family, the leader on this particular important aspect of life unquestionably is the woman. So having said that, clearly at the political level, the representatives over most of history are men, although we have also prophetess at some point. So it's now the point is that today, possibly this is interpreted in a way which is totally wrong. For instance, well, my last sentence, if you still remember my paper, was that if you think there was a slight allusion in what I say, representative political frameworks, well, yes, there is a slight allusion. And I mean, of course, contemporary Israeli politics. There are political parties who are totally of men. The very religious political parties do not have any woman in the parliament. So you can say this is brutal discrimination. I mean, it is simply silly, but that's what it is. In the government of Israel, you have 3 or 4 women out of 33 ministers, and that's totally unrealistic. So that's as a consequence of the above. And so it's unfortunate that a certain misreading of the text, because I have tried in my last sentences to show that the situation is very complicated. I mean, it is a very subtle game of power within the family. As translated in the contemporary parliament, it is simply absurdly unbalanced. And so this means, this may have some relevance for the general study of religion. One thing is to think what the norm is, and another thing is what the norm was. I mean, you read it through certain filters which alter completely the initial meaning of the thing, and then you apply it to contemporary life in a way which, at least in the humble opinion of some of us, is totally biased. No, you must watch the camera.
They want to see you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Irena Borowik, Jagiellonian University. Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. A lot of elements in it was interesting very much. I liked very much that part you compared religious orientations of Jews living in Europe, in the US, and in Israel. And my question concerns this, namely, how do you explain and what factors you find as important in differentiation of these religious orientations in these 3 geographic areas? What do you find as the most important? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, in the full text, I think it becomes quite clear that on some aspects, geography does not count. That is, you find that there is a basic consensus, the sensitivities of people who really live under different political regimes, socio-cultural conditions, and also socioeconomic situations. The sensitivities happen to be quite the same. So this means that there is a certain part, for example, in the hierarchy of the why. We have seen that Holocaust is stronger than God. Everywhere, under any sky, Holocaust beats God significantly, whereas peoplehood is in between. I mean, this is very consistent. And so it means that people, in spite of the differences, do perceive certain fundamentally personal attachments to a world of symbols and of ideas and of hopes and fears in a way which are fundamentally parallel. On the other hand, the distribution by certain parameters, as Professor Tabory has also skillfully demonstrated, are quite different. So this reflects to some extent the selectivity of international migration. Those who happen to come to Israel, somewhat simplifying, still tend to be more motivated than those who choose not to do the same act. And so self-selection in international migration brings certain types of people to go one place and other type of people not to go to that place. At this point, we have a differentiation. So the point of real differentiation is that of the intensity of religious observance and the presence, as we heard, of different denominations, the kind of interpretative styles, certain movements which interpret the rain. I mean, everybody interprets clearly, because I mean, none of us was present on Mount Sinai when God gave the Torah, so we receive it indirectly through interpretation. And so this creates certain organizational frameworks, which also become ideological frameworks or ideational frameworks, I prefer, which tend to be quite differentiated And so they also reflect the, I would say, the cultural atmosphere of the different countries. It is true, I did not elaborate, but I do have a paper showing that in terms of what we might call nationalism, if you take the so-called millennials, the millennials are that generation which was born sort of at the turn of the 20th and the 21st century. You have a very growing distance, putting apart young guys in Israel and in the US. The young people in Israel tend to stress very much nationalism. The young guys in the US tend to stress much more universalism. That is ethics as a general phenomenon, and in Israel maybe territorialism as a Jewish phenomenon. So here really the two groups who have the same age, and I would say even from the socioeconomic point of view today the differences are not that great. However, the cultural atmosphere is very different, and so the hierarchy of options and beliefs tends to become different. So this is definitely manifested at the level of the person. So in conclusion, certain parts do reflect a consensus, and certain other parts do reflect a significant polarization.
Are there questions or comments? Questions? Saibit Kambiak.
Thank you. With your permission, I'll just go back to one of the earlier questions about the role of women. And I just want to say more generally about, we know that the development of technology leads to a lag between law and technology. It takes longer time to adjust law to rapid changes in technology. The lag is even greater in religion. Religion develops, as we all know, in a certain time, place. The norms might have been very progressive at the time. I know that there are analyses of Judaism that say that the role of women in earlier times was a very progressive role, the way that it was seen at that time. But as time changes, as time moves on, as culture changes, we judge the religion by the culture of today, the religion of the past by the culture of today. So within the changing denominations in Judaism, the gap is much less, because the role of women can be changed rapidly. In Orthodox traditional Judaism, the gap is larger, and it takes longer to change. There are women in Orthodox women calling for change, but the strong internalization created by a very strong socialization process also leads many Orthodox women, traditional women, to accept the role that they have in Judaism. So we look at the movement from outside and we say that there is inequality, and yet from inside, there are people who feel that this is the way it should be and who are even satisfied with it. So this is a dilemma that we have of how we look at different movements from an internal perspective, from an external perspective. If we're an anthropologist looking at a a tribe, would we come with our norms? Do we come with our norms and say they are backwards, or try to understand what is developing? I'm not saying that I agree. I definitely don't agree with the role, with the negative role of women in society. But from a perspective of sociology of religion, we have to try to understand and analyze. Okay.
Do someone would like to be removed or no? Bon, it's time for lunchtime. At 3 p.m., we have to be back for 2 more sessions. We had this morning very substantial matter to know and to think about. And we have to apply our contributions for this morning. We see back, we are getting back at 3 p.m. I had 2 in mind, but it is 3. It's okay. We are free.